The Institute of Economic Affairs is a public policy think tank that undertakes research and analysis to help shape public policy discourse. And to do that, we work across 6 thematic areas, which we've demarcated as programs. And just by way of highlighting, we have a public finance management program, futures and foresight, constitutional law and economy, that was the nexus between the constitution and the law, and how that affects the economy, popular economics program, economic regulation and competition policy program, and of course, lastly, the international trade program, under whose auspices we're having this webinar today. Now, looking at matters of international trade, or let me begin from the premise of local trade, regional trade, and international trade. And now looking at what's happening at the global level, we all know that global trade is conducted under some particular rules. And these rules are sort of form some sort of institutions. And at the global level, we have the World Trade Organization, which in the recent past has come under some sort of scrutiny and attack. The reason being that the US, as it is the world leader, sort of instituting some global law changes in terms of the tariffs they're trying to impose or are actually imposing, and that affects the global trade, as it were. Now, because Kenya as a country, and we belong to a regional economic trade bloc, is also affected by these rules. The rules that the US is imposing and the spat between the US and China, and we know that China and US are actually our major global trade partners at the global level. Those rules affect Kenya as a country. And we want to look at this sort of tariff application between US and China, which has sort of brought up some kind of war between trade war that is not the other war. What implication does it have in our country in terms of the opportunities we might have therein, and definitely the challenges that they have that affect Kenya's international trade going forward. And to give us some, shed some insights and give us some light on this very topical subject, I would like to invite my 2 colleagues who work under the International Trade Program, my colleague Moses Mushiri Mwangi and Emmanuel Meshendo, who will give us some insights on this topic of today's webinar, which is the US-China trade war, tariffs and implications for Kenya. And as they load the PowerPoint that I see it on your screen now, just a few housekeeping rules. As we move on with the presentation, your cameras and microphones should remain switched off until the plenary session, at which point we'll allow you to post some questions. We allow you to have your microphone on and camera, and then you can post your question or query. On the same note, there's a chat box functionality within the application, the Teams application. You can post your comment or query as we move on with the presentation, and we will react to it during the plenary session. So without much further ado, as I say, Moses Mushiri, please take it away.
To begin off, demand, and this means the willingness of people to buy and the ability to buy things, is fed into or is fulfilled in 2 ways. One is through local supply, which is from domestic production, and the next one is from international supply, which is from international trade. So a country like Kenya fulfills its demand through those 2 mechanisms. In this webinar, we'll be focusing mostly with international trade, asking ourselves, what is the contribution of international trade, and then ask ourselves, go back now to tariffs. If we can move to the next slide. Now, given the international trade, this means that Kenya consumes products from foreign countries. Now, the question of tariffs comes in. So, what are tariffs? So, tariffs are taxes imposed on imports. Uh, in this case, if a Kenyan decides to buy something from outside Kenya, which are called imports, so whether it's for consumption or for production, government places taxes on those. Uh, these these taxes, which are called tariffs, at some point you'll hear people refer to them as custom duty or import duty, but they all mean the same thing. They are taxes that are imposed by governments on goods and services imported from other countries. So by this, what the government is doing is saying that people are demanding something from a different country, and then they impose a certain tax on it. We are going to see why, and some of the argument brought about on why what that should happen. So they are different. Well, historically, tariffs began from a mercantilist point of view, whereby people emphasized that we should mostly focus on building up, selling to the world and not really buying from the world. And number two, to encourage that to build a country's wealth, we need to focus more on not allowing our demand to mostly be fed from the international trade perspective. So there are different types and forms of tariffs in this case. Number one, and this one is mostly the lowest, is preferential treatment tariffs. And this is whereby countries or two countries, so bilateral or multilateral, decide that they are going to make a trade agreement, and then they are going to lower tariffs for each other. So, for example, it could also be unilateral, whereby one country lowers for the other, but you're not required to reciprocate the same. For example, the AGOA deal, whereby the US reduces tariffs for all export from African countries to the US, or a category of them, but we are not required to do the same for them. Or it could be Kenya agrees with a certain country to lower tariffs both ways to allow trade to happen amongst themselves. So preferential treatment agreements enable countries to trade with each other with lower tariffs. The next type and form of tariff is the most favored nation and bounded tariffs. This one is mostly done by the World Trade Organization, whereby the World Trade Organization members commit to certain level of tariffs for all their trading partners. So these tariffs guide how much import custom duty or tariffs a country will charge all other WTO members that trade with itself, that trade with it. So if Kenya, well, Kenya is a member of WTO. Kenya sets, let's say, a tariff of 10% against imports to Kenya, imports into Kenya, that is. Then they agree within the WTO framework that this will be the applied tariff for all WTO members. So it's called most favored nation because it's required that any WTO member treats all countries equally. So if the lowest tariff that Kenya is charging any other WTO member, it should be applied to all of them. So bounded tariffs, which are mostly associated with most favored nation, is whereby a country decides that within a product line, so whether it's food products or any other product line, Kenya says that we are going, the highest we can charge or we can tax an import will be this level. In that case, then this is the upper bound. So it allows anybody who wants to do business with traders in Kenya to know that this is the highest we can be charged, irrespective of how things change or whatever. Something to note is that the bound and the applied, MFN applied, which is most favored nation applied, the difference gives uncertainty. Notably, developed nations ensure that their bound and what they apply are actually almost the same to allow stability and predictability of tariff lines, so that any business person will be knowing, I don't expect a wide change to happen in the short run if anything in terms of policy was to change in a specific country. So with all these tariff lines and forms and types applying in different scenario, now we have what is called effectively applied tariff, whereby that one shows whatever a country on aggregate charges imports from all over. So whether it was MFN, whether it was on preferential, or whether it was they are not WTO members and so they have higher tariffs for the same. So tariffs are mostly levied on products and services, but these charges, like any other taxes, have a consequence to the economy. And now we need to ask ourselves, why would people charge tariffs? And then we're going to raise argument for, is it worth, does it make economic sense to do the same? And then we'll check what Kenya has so far. So next slide, please. So charging tariffs against imports is called protectionism. And why is it called protectionism? Because when you tax imports, you are making them less competitive in the local market. And therefore, demand for those imports might suffer a substitution effect, whereby people, for example, in the country will opt to buy alternative products rather than the imports because they have been taxed and therefore their costs have gone high depending on their elasticity. So why do people argue for tariffs, or what are the politics of protectionism? One of the major arguments for tariffs is we need to protect our industry. And this is mostly a developing countries argument, whereby we'll argue that we have upcoming industries, they are not in a level to compete with already established industries, and therefore the best way to protect them is to make them grow is to protect them against stiff competition from other industry. Once that argument comes up, so what governments do, they impose high tariff lines on products that these in fact industry are producing. These high tariffs make the already established industry, and in this case, international industry production output more expensive, allowing that the infant industry to actually be able to sell their product more expensively than maybe imports would have been, and also allowing them to survive. So this begs the question, does this argument suffice? Does protecting infant industry allow them to grow to be big industry? In Africa, and this is, I think, sub-Saharan African, about 40% of infant industry do not live to see their first birthday, an indication of a high rate of failure in this industry. Number two, competition in the market allows efficiency in the sense that if we have high competition, it allows companies to improve their production to the most efficient they can be, allowing proper and effective utilization of resources, allowing consumer to enjoy better prices, and also allowing that resources are best utilized where they have the highest productivity. Protecting, in fact, industry, what it does, number one, it allows industry to act in an inefficient point, whereby given that competition is stifled, now this industry get can actually charge higher costs on their output, which diminishes welfare. And number two, there's opportunity cost of resources trade-off. Buying imports, which would have been cheaper than producing them, is exchanged for producing them using more resources at the expense of buying using less resources and using the extra resources to actually produce something that would require less resources, which is in this case mostly cited as comparative advantage. So economics argument and empirical evidence shows that protecting industry does not improve production or productivity, and it also negatively affect welfare. Number two, there is the anti-dumping argument, whereby people argue that if we allow imports to flow in, then other countries are going to dump their products into our country. In Kenya, the second-hand clothes and footwear are the most argued about in this case. What does dumping means in economics? So dumping in economics is price discrimination, international price discrimination, whereby a producer in a different country sells a product for example, a producer in country X sells a product in Kenya at a lower price than they would have sold it in their own country. That is dumping. So some of the argument brought about anti-dumping. For example, recently this year there have been claims in the dailies that we have chicken dumping from Uganda in Kenya. So you need to test this by asking ourselves, Ugandan chicken, how much are they sold Uganda and how much do they sell them in Kenya? And then test the argument whether it qualifies for anti-dumping. In most cases, when the anti-dumping argument is brought about by businesses, it's not, if tested, it's not dumping. But even if dumping was to happen, the WTO mechanism allows for countries to actually institute legislation and also policy direction to ensure that that is checked against. So necessarily, anti-dumping should not be solved using tariffs, but it should be solved using a mechanism of ensuring that doesn't happen. And anti-dumping agency are set up in trade ministry to ensure that happens. So even this argument does not necessarily suffice. And if you'd want to learn more about the second hand clothes argument, the IEA did a research, a very extensive one, about the whole thing of second clothes, which can be found in the IEA website. So there are other arguments of why people actually charge tariffs, but these one are mostly used in developed nations where they argue labor standards, saying that where people are forced to work for long hours at lower pay, making the products cheaper. And then there is, of course, the product standard, biosecurity, there are tariffs for sanctions and security reasons. Most of these arguments do not hold in economics soundness. And the reason because, the arguments are more based on the politics of countries wanting to fit into political lobbying and all that, and also the strength of unions and all that, rather than the economic argument of welfare and prosperity. So next slide, please. So we ask ourselves, well, does Kenya charge tariffs to imports? So Kenya is a member of the East Africa community, which has a common external tariff line that dictate or guide on how Kenya should charge its tariffs against what product. But notably from the effectively applied tariffs, we can notice that food products are the highest tariffed items in Kenya. And one of the things you notice is how volatile it happens over the year. And if you give it a keener look, you realize that the food tariffs have a political disruption mechanism whereby the years that are near elections or whatever, tariffs always change direction, either going high or low, depending on the political temperature of that season. So we going ahead, we'll ask ourselves, why would we charge high taxes on foods imported into the country? The next highest charge thing in Kenya is consumer goods. So final products are highly tariffed in Kenya, and this is mostly because of the Eastern Africa Commission CET, that's the Common External Tariff Mechanism, whereby they say that we should prevent final products from coming into our country or into East African countries if there's an alternative for it in the same country, which we shall test and see whether that argument suffices. There have been a desire in Kenya to actually industrialize and start light manufacturing and processing. But we can also clearly see that capital goods, which are used in production, and intermediate goods, which are used and consumed in bringing a final output, are also tariffed averagely above 5%, which also begs the question that with the idea of improving manufacturing, why would we tax things that are actually supposed to help in that journey? So this is Kenya as it is. So since 2000 all the way to the most recent data, which is 2022. Next slide, please. So we ask ourselves, well, Kenya charges tariffs. So who pays for these tariffs? So there are different costs that tariffs brings about, and these costs are dependent on one, price elasticity of demand, and this one we mean how much does demand change when price changes? Would people continue consuming a particular item if its prices rose or dropped? So from that basis, we also ask ourselves, what goes into production? And so how much does the cost of production change if the items that goes into production are taxed? And then we'll ask ourselves, if we produce an output at a certain cost, how competitive can it become in the global market? And why is it important that Kenya focuses on the global market? And then we'll ask ourselves, given that tariffs reduce efficiency, what is the cost of that? So let's start with the consumption cost. Next slide, please. So once a tariff is charged on an item, what it does, if this item demand is not affected by prices, the producer is going to pass the additional cost to the consumer. So the cost of this good is going to go high. In this case, we say that it's inelastic. The demand is inelastic. So once that happens, these items are likely to get more expensive. So like we saw, food and consumer goods are the most tariffed imports in Kenya. As we all know, food is very inelastic, given that people will have to take food irrespective of whether it's cheap or expensive. So once high tariffs are charged on imports of food, it means the food prices will go high and other consumables, and people will have to pay for this high cost. Now, the question here becomes, Kenya population, 40% as of 2022, that is 39.8 to be precise, percent of Kenya's population live below the poverty line. That means that their welfare is quite constrained. With food and consumer goods being the most tariffed in the country, then their costs are likely to go high. And we will share a graph to show how the cost of food has been changing over time. And that therefore, that negatively affects the welfare of people. We already have high poverty rates, food prices are high locally, and then we have high tariffs against import of food, and therefore that negatively affects people's living standard. Number two on this is when we charge high tariffs on food and consumable, we are forcing substitution, whereby imports become expensive compared to local products. Once they become expensive, people have to consume local goods alone, and that one limits their pool of choice. And that's an ethical concern because government is deciding for people on what they should consume and what they should not, based using tariffs as a mechanism to do that. Next slide, please. Now, as you can see here is that food prices have been going higher relatively than all other products in the economy. If this happened, the best scenario would be to encourage imports of food so that the prices stop rising at this rate. But what the government is doing, as shown in Kenya's effectively applied tariffs on imports, is that food and consumable goods are the most tariffed. We put this question and mostly to policymakers that we want to improve people's welfare. There's high poverty rate in the country. About 44.8% of disposable income in the country is used on food. The food prices are going high, and therefore, this indication of food pricing going high should have indicated to policymakers that we need lower tariffs on food and consumable to encourage more imports, which will lower the cost of living for people. But what we witness in the country is the opposite is happening. Next slide, please. So this is comparison between percentage household share spending on food and how much calories they get. So as of 2015, and for Kenya, this is still the same picture because in 2022, it showed that 44.8% of household spending is on food. But as we can see, the daily calories per capita, which is calories per person in a day, are lower than compared to other countries like the United States, where they use less than 10% of their income to buy food. This shows us one thing, that food prices is a sensitive issue in Kenya because there's a lot of, it has a high percentage share of household spending, and therefore for people's welfare to be optimized, then food pricing is one of the key things. And one of the major ways to ensure that happens is to allow free trade through lowering the tariffs on food to improve people's welfare. Next slide. So, and I'm completing this section so that I'll also invite Emmanuel to continue. So this is a simulation of impacts of tariffs on sugar. The cheapest sugar globally is produced in Brazil and India. Kenya has 100% tariff on sugar. What that means is if you import sugar, which is valued at 100 shilling, on landing into Kenya, it's charged an extra 100. So the total cost becomes 200. And there are other levies that are charged on sugar. We have the Sugar Development Levy. This one was instituted this year, which is 4%. We have, like I said, a tariff or an import duty of 100%. We have import declaration fee. We have the Railway Development Levy. We have VAT. So all these summed up with other costs, and I must say that some of the costs were not considered here, like manufacturing, local transport, and handling. It makes imported sugar more expensive. But notably, even with all these tariffs and levies to discourage importation of sugar, and this is mostly advised because in East Africa community and COMESA, they discourage importation of sugar because some of the member countries produces sugar. Even with all these tariffs and levies, global sugar still remains to be cheaper and mostly from India than Kenyans. So when government realized that this is not working, they totally banned importation of sugar outside EAC and COMESA. So Kenyans have to pay a higher cost to enjoy their sugar product, irrespective of what the global prices are. And this, like I said before, uh, cuts down on people's welfare, which should be the intention of policies that are intended to improve people's welfare. So next slide. On the production bit and the global market. So how does tariffs increase production cost? If we tariff intermediate and capital goods, which are necessary for production, it means that we have to pay more to produce. That's number one. If we tariff imports of goods into the country, what it means, local industry will have to produce things to meet local demand. And some of these things that they have to produce would better be bought at a cheaper price than produced locally. So there's a resource trade-off whereby the opportunity cost of producing something locally is higher than if we had bought it and focused on producing goods that we have comparative advantage on. So how does this reduce global competitiveness? So in this case, if we are protecting ourselves against high competition from outside the country, what that does is it makes us produce at a higher cost. And given that this higher cost relative to global cost, it means that we cannot sell outside Kenya competitively because somebody or a different producer is producing at a lower cost. And given that the Kenyan market is small, it means also growth of Kenyan industry is also limited. So I'll end it at this point, and then I'll invite Emmanuel to talk about what the global tariff landscape looks like and what that means for us as a country.
Thank you.
All right.
So what Moses has taken us through is to contextualize what tariffs do to to an economy, to firms, to households at the local level. And so the what he has presented us is with an economic background, a contextualization of what it means for household and firm welfare when taxes are imposed, when tariffs are imposed. The fact that tariffs are a tax on 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 consumption, um, how they affect incomes, and what kind of strategies that households and firms will pursue when tariffs are imposed on them, and that fundamentally how the arguments that are made in defense of tariffs fall flat when the facts are assessed. Now, when we look out into the world and we ask ourselves, then uh, what the big deal with tariffs is. Another question that arises in parallel is what role the tariffs have played in trade. Why are they a hot topic right now? Well, fundamentally, a liberalized trade has generated some benefits for households and firms worldwide. Essentially, what this means is that there was a time, and there have been periods in human history when neighbors have tried to restrict the flow of goods and services and the flow of people and the flow of the factors of production for all kinds of reasons. Now, this reached its its peak. This human tendency translated into policy to stop trade from crossing borders reached a very important fever pitch in the early 20th century. It was in that time that the last great trade war happened, and what followed that was an attempt to reduce the barriers to trade. So first of all, before us, we can see a chart that just shows the evolution of world trade from the 1950s to the year 2022 in billions of dollars. So you can see that what happened was that in 1950s, or if we go a little forward to 1970s, when we had a population of about 3 billion people, right? So that's 3 billion people, and the world GDP was $3 trillion. So that time, if you distributed the total output of the world between all the people that were alive at that time, then each person would have had a GDP per capita of about $993. Now, in the year 1970, the world's exports in total, right, which is another way to say the value of global trade, was $385 billion. You divide that out in per capita terms, that was $127. So moving from 1970 to 2023, when world GDP has reached just about $100 trillion, the value of world trade is about $31 trillion. Now, at $31 trillion, the world is essentially richer than it was 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 90 years ago. What happened 90 years ago? What is underlying this explosion in global trade? Well, world trade, let's say in volume terms, expanded 45 times what it was in the early 40s. This is due to the rules-based world trading order. One of the most important rules, or the set of rules underlying this rules-based world trade order, was rules governing the gradual reduction in tariffs. So it was because nations of the world all agreed to coordinate a gradual reduction in tariffs that world trade grew to this intensified level that we find it at today. So how can we think about the rewards that an institution like the World Trade Organization in general and mechanisms like the lowering of tariffs actually generated to members of the World Trade Organization? So one study showed that WTO membership earned welfare increases of 855 billion, or 4.51% per member country. So the US, ever since it joined the WTO, saw income gains of $87 billion. China and Germany each saw income gains of 86 billion and 66 billion respectively. This is by the year 2022. So here we have it. What it's telling us is that all members of the WTO have benefited from membership in the WTO, right? And essentially, membership in an institution that has encouraged the lowering of tariffs, the standardization of trade, the coordinated negotiation of trade agreements, treating each other fairly. All this has accrued benefits for all the members. But of course, those members that are the most industrialized benefited the most from membership in the WTO. Now, here you can see China benefited from access to American markets, from being able to manufacture products for the United States. This is also true for Germany. So it's not just the US, but the world itself. And the United States also was able to trade with nations like China. You can also think if a government of a small country like Kenya has to go and negotiate trade agreements and enforce these agreements with each and every one of its bilateral trading partners, that would be much more costly. And in a world without the WTO, it would be more difficult to, you wouldn't find a world whose barriers are lowering like they have since the end of the Second World War. But now we've entered what you could call an upside down world. So the United States has, so the chart before us actually illustrates the level of US tariffs between the year 1927 and the year 2022. And what you can see is that the last time that specifically American tariffs were as high as they are now was the year 1932. And that was a time when the United States made a decision to raise tariffs in order to protect its economy. They thought we are going to actually reduce the negative effects of the global recession, but this only made the global recession worse. Right? Everyone was raising tariffs against each other, left, right, and center, and essentially the world was impoverished. This only deepened the economic crisis that the world and especially the world that was more integrated at that time experienced. So then the world ends and the war ends, sorry, and the United States takes to reducing its tariff rate. Now you can tell from what, for example, Moses presented that American tariffs were lower even than those of Kenya. So what these unprecedented events have had and will continue to have some unintended consequences. So one study from the budget lab at Yale estimated that the American household lost $3,800 in US dollar terms in 2024 US dollar terms. This was before even the April 2nd announcement, right? So because of a rise in of 2.3% in American price levels, right? A rise in price levels that followed the imposition of tariffs. American households lost more than what the average Kenyan household earns in a year. One of the rationale that the current US administration had actually proposed and said, look, this is one of the reasons why we are raising tariffs, was that they want to reduce their public deficits, right? The public sector deficits. So, well, some studies have shown that when the reduction will not be enough. Now, intuitively, what is the effect of a tariff? A tariff takes away from household and firm surplus, right? The welfare that they enjoy. It creates a deadweight loss, just like a tax, which is that it destroys efficiencies. And because a tariff is not like a guided weapon system that you can take it and hit only what you intend to hit, right? The unintended consequences include the destruction of economic activity that's in places that you might not expect. Now, for the United States alone, In the short term, that's in the next 3 to 5 years, it was estimated that the tariffs would raise 3.1 trillion in revenues, but they would destroy 582 billion in output. This gives us a sense of just how destructive tariffs can be. We have seen how tariffs are already impoverishing Kenyan households because Kenyan households cannot access the cheaper food that would result in their expanded welfare because of tariffs. Now, if a tariff regime from the United States can wipe out 5 times Kenya's present GDP, well, you get a sense of just how destructive tariffs can be. Now, what would the effect on developing economies be? Well, one example of, on the one hand, the collision between the arguments made in favor of tariffs and the reality is the example of the Ivory Coast. So the 76% of exports from the Ivory Coast to the United States were last year were made in cocoa beans. So if the United States said that we are not going to import any more cocoa beans from the Ivory Coast and that we're going to produce all of it domestically, well, Hawaii's 3,500 acres of land could not replace Ivory Coast's 11.8 million acres of cocoa bean farms, right? So you can't, there are comparative advantages that are tied to multitude of factors, including your land area, your total land area, where your land is, how fertile your land is, the geographic conditions. There are other comparative advantages that accrue because of the accumulation of knowledge. But at its core, it's very difficult to just move around comparative advantages at will. Tariffs actually serve both to destroy comparative advantages, but the nations are likely to fail to find substitutes, right, for the benefits that that accrue to them by virtue of trade. Now, the other fact to consider is that the US tariffs actually went against World Trade Organization rules. This is an existential threat to a regime, the World Trade Organization's the regime represented by that institution. So, for example, the United States was entitled to a 9.4% reciprocal tariff against Vietnam. What does that mean? That is simply saying that before the April 2nd tariff regime, American tariffs against Vietnam were already lower than Vietnamese tariffs against the United States. And under WTO rules, the United States was actually entitled to raise reciprocal tariffs against Vietnam to the point of 9.4%. But instead, what did they do? They raised tariffs to 46%. So they went against WTO rules. One of the reasons that a country like China went and actually filed complaints to the WTO was, it was following the rules. And some have interpreted this politically to say that they've also done that to show that they are rule followers while the United States is not, which in this case has some truth to it. So what the trade war, this tariff war means is that one of its implications is that it's actually an existential threat to the world trading, the world trading system that was born after the Second World War and that has accrued so many benefits to its members. If countries had to negotiate for trade agreements bilaterally, that would be extremely costly. The United Kingdom after Brexit is a very good example. So, for example, if the United States were to exit the world, right? This is a scenario that's in some ways comparable to the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. Now, it would be very costly for nations of the world to do without a system like the WTO, because now you have to do all this negotiation one by one, step by step, partner by partner. We are losing a hard-earned gradual liberalization of trade. But it should be noted that for countries like Kenya would not only be losing from a system. Countries like Kenya that are small and need to be connected to the world have already themselves been waging trade wars against the world. We just, some of us just did not know it. So, in essence, tariffs are a claim on the private property of consumers and producers. They are a tax on the consumption of foreign goods. They induce income and substitution effects. And as we continue to assess the second, third, and fourth order and onwards effects of tariffs, it's that they actually are taking us back into a world that shuts the door, whose members shut the door on each other. A very, very expensive world, and a world that impoverishes, especially those who are poorest. A country like Kenya need not produce everything on its own. A small country like Kenya, and in fact, in economics, we will say that it's not nations that benefit, but households and firms. So these households and firms benefit from having a wide range of choices of goods and services that they can consume. These choices are widened by world trade, and a regime like the World Trade Organization and its efforts to reduce tariffs make it easier for consumers to access these markets. Kenyans have already paid a huge and painful cost for tariffs. They need not continue to pay more. In fact, Kenya should pursue unilateral liberalization of trade rather than flying off to yet another country and another country to negotiate yet another trade deal. And we can take the example of Singapore, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, that themselves liberalized trade. Hong Kong, in particular, liberalized its trade unilaterally and benefited greatly from it. Right? For the Netherlands, international trade is 3 times the size of its economy, because you're importing and then exporting things again. So many goods are passing through your ports. Why have a port if you're going to shut the door to the world? Trade liberalization is a poverty reduction measure. Kenyan policymakers speak of protecting Kenya. That's a word that is very powerful because, it's a good thing. It's good to be protected. It's good to protect. Who would argue against protection? But then we must ask ourselves, what are the actual effects of protection? Protecting who? A firm? Protectionist measures like tariffs actually serve to protect firms and harm households. That is to say, we should ask ourselves, what are the other effects of this so-called protection? Who is being protected, and who bears the pain? Life in Kenya would be so sweet right now if we didn't have all these tariffs. After Moses' explanation, that is to be taken quite literally. Thank you.
Moses, go ahead.
All right. The question is our perspective on AGOA, its renewal, and what that would mean if it was not renewed. Well, the United States is among our key trade partners, accounting for about 10% of our international trade. That 10%, about 56% of it is under AGOA, which allow us to to export things to the US on zero tariff. Average total export to the US as of 2022 are charged 0.3 tariff to enter the US market. Well, the current US administration has an intention to reduce their trade deficit. And given that Kenya is amongst a net exporter to, well, now we are a net importer from the US, but we see a scenario whereby we are likely not to have an extension of AGOA. Although last year there was an intention to extend it to 2041, but now with the new current administration and their international trade orientation, that might not happen. And therefore, if that happens, and with our textile industry, which is almost a differentiated product trade for the US, if we'll have to trade under the 10% tariff, then it means our competitive edge will diminish to some extent. And therefore that might stifle the growth of the textile industry in the country. But either way, like Emmanuel argued and clearly saw, that liberalizing trade in Kenya is beneficial, whether or not the US will charge us the 10% tariff or they're going to recede on the same. But yeah, there's likely to be a cost if that becomes the case, and given that AGOA lapses in September this year. So Kenya has been trying to have a trade and investment program with the US. Hopefully that can allow us to freely trade with the US going ahead. But also that one is still yet to be completely agreed upon. Thank you.
Thanks, Moses, for that. I see a question in the chat box, but before I read it out, anyone wants to raise their to speak? Right. So let me just read this out to our presenters. So Cohen asks, how will the tariffs affect the stock market performance in Kenya? And then second, that is, what sectors are likely to be affected? So the effect of the tariffs on stock market performance, and more specifically, which sectors are likely to be affected. So that's both to you, Emmanuel and Moses. Emmanuel, you wanna go first?
Sure. Okay. So in principle, the first question, the most fundamental question is who is exposed to global trade? How exposed are they to global trade? How big are they, and are they traded on the stock market? So since I haven't looked specifically at this question, but I can still answer it intuitively. So the firms for which all these things are true would be the most affected. Now, this is for their own activities. They're fundamentally, right? Because the firms now have to make their own decisions about what their first of all, if they're exporting to the United States or any country that has raised tariffs against them. Now, what does that mean for the change in the demand for their product, wherever their product is going? And then they would have to adjust accordingly. You know, if let's say you had two major alcoholic beverage manufacturers, one of them is much bigger, maybe it's connected to a big multinational, and another one is small, just a purely local firm. The purely local firm might, you know, depending on how big its domestic market is, how big its export market is, its export market could be destroyed. Right now, when we get to the stock market now, if both of these firms are publicly traded, then this also depends on the speculative actions of those who buy and share their stock. So a country like Kenya doesn't have, it's not especially deep, doesn't have very deep financial markets. So not so many firms are active up there. Those that are, well, those that have invested both domestically and globally will have different reasons for, let's say, pulling out their money. um, if if an investor thinks that, okay, a Kenyan firm will no longer be able to export to the United States, maybe for the foreseeable future, that market will be wiped out, and I don't know that they can compensate with any other market. I might pull out. So then, you could see a firm that exposed like that having a stock just fall dramatically, even though maybe even before they themselves start to make changes in their activities. Some people could just pull out. And then because the tariffs are they involve such major changes to the global trading system. Now, the others, investor confidence, right? If I'm not confident in the United States, then I'm not confident in Kenya either. Then I'm not confident in a firm from Kenya that's trading in the US. And maybe I move my assets somewhere to like gold. So I mean, all I've given is, and maybe you're already aware of this kind of intuition, but so it would be beneficial to others. Stock markets move in a behave differently from the fundamentals of the economics. You've seen American stock markets surge just from whispers about Trump's policy intentions, and then crumble from other whispers. All because actions that now I know I've gone a bit further than your question, but I thought it was important to get into that. The character of your financial markets, which is a reflection of of investor confidence to some degree, right? Not a full 100%, but to some degree, is dependent both on the economic fundamentals and political stability. People like American investments because it is seen as a politically stable nation, a nation of strong institutions, right? So I've come full circle and try to say that as policy scholars interested in development, we are interested in two things: fundamental economic growing output, right? Sound fundamental economics, and we are interested in sound institutions because those two feed into each other. Thank you.
Thanks, but I think the other thing you need to probably get into a little bit are the sectors likely to be affected. Moses, want to take that?
Yeah, just
Okay.
to add on a few on what Emmanuel has said. So the stock market allows people to actually purchase a part of a company elsewhere, which are listed. So on tariffs bit, and we have seen the reaction of the US stock markets with the policy change in the US. The stock market depends on the confidence of the investors. And this is dependent on predictability. So, like I pointed earlier, that most developing countries have a huge difference between their bounded tariff and their most favored tariff. That gap, which most policymakers in development nations say they give themselves room for policy adjustment, affects how much predictability can be accumulated by investors on Kenya's market. in that scenario, it means that the confidence in our market is also not that high, well, comparatively, and this is globally. And therefore, if tariffs keep changing, and like we have seen, for example, consumable effectively applied tariffs for food product and consumer goods are quite volatile in Kenya. That affects investors' confidence in investing in stocks of companies that especially deal with those products, whether it's production or just importing and selling them. And the reason becomes here is if government changes the tariff policy tomorrow, it might bring a substitution effect to the disadvantage of that specific farm. And therefore, the investor is left wondering, is left at a risk of making losses. And that's why the stock market does not control how the economy reacts, but the policies and the economic activities actually dictate how the stock market behaves. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Yes, Emmanuel.
Yes, maybe.
Go ahead.
So I'll add now away from the sectors that would be affected, right? Okay, so Kenya exports about 784 million to the US. And well, what do we export to the US? Textiles are one of our exports to the US. So that's one sector that would be affected. You also have just a second, just pulling up some of the.
Yeah, that's okay, Emmanuel.
Yeah. So, sorry, actually, it's 838 million that we export to the US. Half of that, just a bit more than half of that, is made in textiles. So, the cost of those textiles has gone up because of the tariffs, right? And then the second most important set of exports we made to the US are made in vaccines, actually. So those would also be affected. That's about 157 million or 18% of our exports to the US that would be affected by these tariffs. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that. I propose you also give us the source for those numbers, Emmanuel, as we proceed. As you do that, also note our dear listeners and participants, we have the blog that was done on international trade landscape, AGOA and Trump tariffs, so you can have a look at that on our website. We've posted it on the chat box. You might just click on the link and download to read. I see a hand. Jairus Kedogo, kindly unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. In the presentation, they talked about the sugar industry being one of those sectors that is very protected by these tariffs. At the same time, we have seen local industries struggling, especially those that are being run by government. And maybe this could be pointing to a failure of these protectionist policies to achieve the intended goals. So maybe I would ask this way. Like, is it time that we drop these tariffs, especially on sugar? And what actually, maybe another thing would be, what actually informs these decisions to preserve the status quo despite these outcomes that we have seen? Thank you.
Right. Moses and Emmanuel, back to you.
All right. Well, what informs tariffs? Why does government continue to protect industry even if their sales be failing? So this one will require us to dwell a bit about incentives and behavioral economics. Number one is that economics is affected by political power. Political power in democracy are influenced by the voting power. So from that angle, one of the incentives of protecting an industry could be how much lobbying power that the producers in that industry actually behold. And the reason why we are arguing against high tariffs and protectionism is the market is best placed to secure human welfare compared to government. Because when the government decides who will be the losers or who will be the winners, or who should be protected and who should not, then it brings we get ourselves in a scenario like the sugar industry. India and Brazil have a very high comparative advantage in sugar production. The global sugar prices are way lower than the Kenyan prices. But by protecting, issuing high tariffs against sugar, well, in Kenya we have 100% tariff against sugar, and unfortunately that didn't work also. And then we have a total ban on importing sugar in Kenya outside COMESA and EAC. So what that does is it one of the reasons why industry need to be protected is because they cannot compete fairly within the market. A lack of the ability to compete fairly shows an inefficiency or a lack of comparative advantage in that specific product line. And therefore, it's best placed to allow us to buy sugar, which is produced at a lower cost, and therefore the output will be cheaper than to actually produce ourselves, because that leaves us with extra resources that we can invest elsewhere. So in the best thing we would advise government here is to allow actually the sugar industry to open up to the globe, allow importation. So what would be the consequence of that? Number one, we'll either see the local sugar industry improving their productivity efficiency, or it might dictate that we need to see people in that production line shift into a different line that they have a higher productivity level. And that, of course, will mean that we have improved welfare, we'll have less resources trade-off. But we also have to understand that because the sugar producers in Kenya have a high lobbying power in terms of their voting power, that might be one of the influences of why they are also amongst the most protected industry in the country. But clearly it's harming human welfare. And like I said, about 40% of Kenyans are below the poverty line. So we don't need to expose them to very high food prices and consumer goods prices. And the best way to do that is to allow us to enjoy cheap prices if the global prices are lower than the Kenyan market prices. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Moses. I think you brought that out really, really well, bringing the nexus between political and economic power and the effect of that thereof. I see a hand up. Kabugi, kindly unmute and ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you. That was a very well done presentation. Now I have a question. Looking at the sugar industry in Kenya, and people from say Mumias want to continue producing sugar because that area really does well in terms of sugarcane production. But now our comparative advantage is not directed towards sugarcane production. So is it really possible for a country to produce say Kenya has a comparative advantage in the production of tea, but the entire nation cannot produce tea. So what is the solution for this? Because if we cannot tell people to produce that commodity which we have a comparative advantage in, we still cannot tell them to stop producing that which they can produce best, such as sugarcane. So what is the way?
Yeah,
Emmanuel, go ahead.
yeah, it's a very good question. I think, look, Moses tried to explain two things. First of all, why sugar, the trade in sugar specifically, should be liberalized. Look, life would be sweeter. You'll be eating sugar that's much cheaper. And then he explained why it is that it's not liberalized. So, in essence, as someone who doesn't want to feel the pain of competing with the world and of shifting his economic activities. And one question is, why does that set of people deserve protection and not anyone else? You know, I could also say that I would want to be protected in my job and that the government should protect my job by providing me with a subsidy. You know, my job is also important. So now the question of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage actually accrues to firms, not to countries. So it's not our comparative advantage, really. It's a comparative advantage of those who do the work to discover where those comparative advantages lie and to exploit them and to continue to develop them. So the entrepreneur should be given the room to discover on his own. When market conditions change, he changes his activities. There's a poor country cannot waste its very, very meager resources protecting someone. Because look, it's not just sugar that we're spending money on as a government. We have schools to build, classrooms to in which to put teachers, you know, roads to build. We have public goods to produce. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Any other comment, question? I'm not seeing any in the chat box, and no one has his or her hand up. So I guess I'll invite our presenters to make their final comments as we come to the close of this topical discussion. I'll begin with you, Moses. Your final comment?
Yeah, sure. Simply put, international trade, and trade in general allows a win-win scenario for everybody. For countries with a small market that intends to grow, for a country that compares its desires with Singapore's, if we have to take advantage of the larger global market, then we have to allow to liberalize our trade. Remember, we have fewer resources. We need to ensure that we have low opportunity cost, and the best way to do that is to allow free trade to happen. It's time we consider lowering our tariffs, which are way higher than even what we are now criticizing the US administration to have set against us. Trade is a win-win, protectionism is a lose-lose. So we need to choose better. Thank you.
Thanks, Moses. That was really straightforward. Emmanuel, over to you.
Well, the public should not should question the sort of language that tends to take us away from thinking about what is actually the implications of what is being said. Public officials will sometimes say, we are protecting you. And as soon as you hear that you're being protected, you forget. But a country like Kenya has been impoverishing itself. We've been putting ourselves on an embargo. If Kenyans woke up and found ships of a foreign navy blocking us from getting food into the country, we would be outraged. And if we would be even more angry if we found that it was our own people, our own neighbors, or our own colluding with our own government to block us from getting food from abroad, food that is cheaper and that would make life easier for us. Well, the question we should be asking with tariffs are, in what instances are our own governments and our own people blocking us from a better life? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Emmanuel, and thanks a lot, Moses. And of course, let me take this opportunity as we come to the end to thank all our participants for taking the time to be with us and for asking the questions and making the comments. This presentation will be available on our website as soon as we are done with this webinar. And we'd like to say that the IEA is a membership organization. We invite you to be members so that you can participate in public policy discourse and help shape the policy landscape of our country to better it and to have a prosperous country. Finally, we invite you to keep visiting our social media sites for upcoming events, webinars, and meetings at which we can, of course, discuss topical issues and matters that affect our country. With that, thank you once again, and do have a lovely afternoon.